And so when we look at the effective implementation from the asset owner side, generally we recommend starting with a benchmark study to really understand where it is you're starting from, and analyzing risks for that same reason as well, to understand what's currently in place and also where your highest risk and exposure is. So what are the areas that you need to focus on first? Once you have that understanding of the current state, building a roadmap or putting together the specific plan of each individual step and plan timeframes can help to stay on target and really drive that growth. From there, it's important to have a cybersecurity management plan or an overall system. And we really highlight it being OT specific because although there's a lot of great things that we can leverage from the IT side, because the risk is on the OT systems, there needs to be an OT specific understanding and also OT ownership. And so these OT procedures may sit under the overall IT umbrella. They may be managed by a group that's led by IT. But it's important that we really make sure that there is information specific to OT systems and the approach required for OT environments as part of that cybersecurity management plan. We can look at embedding cybersecurity into the project lifecycle and the design of the system. So specifying the right requirements, making sure that whether it's a security level target or a specific set of requirements that the vendor needs to meet, that's defined and that's used as a part of implementing future systems or upgrading existing systems. And then lastly, we can think about how we roll out and maintain both that program and also the overall security of the industrial control systems over time. And we'll talk about some specific recommendations for each of those areas. So in terms of a benchmark assessment, there are a lot of different terms with somewhat similar meanings, but they tend to be thrown around in the security world. So, for example, what's the difference between a gap assessment and a vulnerability assessment versus a risk assessment? So typically gap assessments focus a bit more on the policy and procedure aspects, whereas a vulnerability and risk assessment, in vulnerability assessment, you're looking at specific holes in the system. And in a risk assessment, you're looking, as those holes as part of it, but also looking at the likelihood and the consequence. And so what we'll recommend is kind of splitting that perspective and understanding that the benchmark may be done to really understand the procedural aspects and where your overall organization or your approach has holes, and the cybersecurity risk assessment may be paired with a vulnerability assessment to really understand what the system-specific vulnerabilities and exposures are, as well as what the system-specific risks are. And so ultimately, when we follow that type of approach, we want to understand where our current exposure is and also understand how mature we are as an organization. And if we include the stakeholders as part of these benchmark analysis and risk assessments, we can really help to build buy-in over time, show them the specific considerations that they're going to be responsible for, show them the risks that are currently in place and what it will really take to address those, and help to build that plan over time. And so, for example, for our benchmark, we may pick a standard such as 62443-2-1 and really look at the procedural aspects of how are our current procedures and practices lining up with what we need to do to be having an effective program. And that'll help us really understand, do we have weaknesses through our people? Do we have weaknesses in our overall method? And things that we're going to have to globally address. Whereas for the risk assessment, as a specific example, this is now looking at the likelihood of cybersecurity incidents. It's looking at how significant those incidents would be if they occurred, and the potential outcomes of that in terms of the risk and any risk mitigation actions that are required, as well as existing or planned countermeasures that are credited with reducing that likelihood. And so the cyber risk assessment, sometimes called a cyber PHA or cyber HAZOP, is really a robust method for getting that understanding and finding out what the highest risk scenarios are, what the highest risk facilities or parts of the organization are, and then focusing resources there and taking the right steps to reduce that risk moving forward. So having both that procedural view and also that system risk specific view is really important for knowing where a company is. And so once we have that information, then we can really look at building a roadmap together. And the roadmap is not something that is going to be the same for every organization, but there are some typical steps that we see along the way. So first, we need to have competency. If we don't have competent people, if we don't have training plans in place, we're not going to build the skills necessary to tackle these challenges. Cybersecurity is a complex field, and then when we overlay that with the complexity of industrial control systems and the potential process safety impacts, we really do have a lot that we need to understand or train people on in order for them to understand and help manage those risks. So building competency is often a required initial step. Then we can look at assessing gaps through benchmark studies and assessing our current risks through cybersecurity risk assessment. We can look to create the cybersecurity management system with an OT focus, and then develop and roll that out to our different sites, to our different parts of the organization, and then track performance over time. And so although the specific steps or the time frame and the way in which we do this may change, in general, we'll have to cover many of these steps to build a successful cybersecurity program for an OT or ICS organization. And so if we look at the next step there about how we can look at building a cybersecurity management system, as we've gone through and done benchmark studies, we've seen a lot of common gaps. Some are as simple as not really having the right documentation in place or not defining it clearly. And so in general, we can build out those through a top-level cybersecurity management system document where we have the process, we have the ownership within the organization, the life cycle, and who is the owner for each of those life cycle steps within a project. And so by doing that, we can really help to improve that communication, that definition of responsibilities. Then when it comes to things like the repeatability or understanding risk and defining those specific cybersecurity requirements, having standards and procedures for each of those lifecycle tasks underneath that top level procedure then helps to build out that program and really show exactly what's needed to, let's say, meet the requirements of IEC 62443. Or, not just the standard requirements, but also looking at regulatory requirements within the region and saying, how are we going to not only meet those, but also meet best practices as well? Or how can we leverage existing best practices and procedures in order to demonstrate that we're meeting our regulatory requirements? And so for that top level document, we can think about having the overall scope, defining how it's managed within the organization, looking at how we're going to train and develop competency within our staff. We can have specific requirements for competency built in. We can look at maintaining and managing our compliance to the requirements of our internal policies and procedures through periodic audits, through a continuous improvement process to grow and build that program over time. And for the top level CSMS, we're not going to define all of the lifecycle steps or exactly what has to be done for each of those lifecycle steps. But we will outline that a cybersecurity lifecycle approach is followed and identify and provide references to those specific procedures that give more guidance, more details on that top level policy. And so for those, we'll really drive through the cybersecurity lifecycle that's outlined in 62443 and think about everything we need to do from the assessment phase, like the cybersecurity risk assessments that we talked about, identifying the critical assets, through the implementation and design phase where we are applying countermeasures, adding protections into our systems, specifying those requirements to vendors and equipment suppliers, and then testing them during the cyber portions of FAT and SAT. Then we can look at the maintain phase of once the system's implemented or once our upgrade is completed, what is it going to take on an ongoing basis to maintain the security of that system? And so all three of those areas really need to be looked at and considered when implementing the program. And then lastly, we can look at, as we build out those procedures, having a good starting point is something that can certainly help increase the speed of deployment, make sure that the relevant standard requirements are met, and also look to embed and use additional industry best practices. And so this is something where for both that top level CSMS and a lot of the critical procedures in the lifecycle task, we've actually developed templates that we use internally when we're writing and developing cybersecurity procedures, as well as templates that can be purchased by our customers if they want to use those as a starting point. So that's just one example of something that can be done to help kickstart the CSMS or that portion of the roadmap. And one template that I want to just take a quick look at is the cybersecurity requirement specification. And when we talk about embedding cybersecurity requirements into your project lifecycle or building that in as part of your system specification, using a document like this where the security level requirements or the targets that need to be met, the specific description and understanding of the system and how it should be designed and how it should be implemented, having this all in one document can be very helpful. It can be used for requesting vendor scopes, can be used as test case requirements and be the start of what you're going to build into, let's say, a CFAT and CSAT procedures. And so having this is one really good way to embed those requirements that come out of your cyber risk assessment into projects and into future steps that will be taken. And so then when we think about the rollout for a cybersecurity program and our specific countermeasures or mitigation actions that we're going to take, it's important to go back to that pragmatic approach, right? And having the roadmap and understanding how you roll that out is really key. And so the first one is we've got to be realistic on our goals and deadlines. And I've seen it very many times where companies have an assessment, they realize that where they're starting from a cyber posture is maybe not where they hope to or expected to be. And as an outcome of that, they've got hundreds of recommendations, hundreds of actions, and they're trying to get everything done in a week or a month. And a lot of times we don't build in the time or the resources that are really needed to put in the work and get these policies set up or to make the organizational changes or the implementation of the right controls. And so understanding that this is a process that takes time is critical. So that's something that is really important for goal and timing setting. The next thing is we've got to be sensible in our approach. It's not possible to deploy cyber countermeasures to 100 sites simultaneously, or even if we only have 10 sites, we should really be focusing on the highest risk site first. Or if we only have one site, but we have multiple areas in it, we should focus on what are the most critical areas first. And so using the results of that risk assessment to know what are the most important controls to apply, knowing what are the areas where they're most needed, can help us focus that effort and start with pilot sites. Once we work out the kinks and understand any of the specific challenges that we're going to face, we can then deploy it more effectively at other sites. And we can also talk about what I call the bang for buck improvements or the low hanging fruit, where based on the risk assessments, a lot of times we'll see there are going to be specific threat scenarios, whether it's an internal disgruntled employee or let's say remote access that's not well controlled for legacy accounts. And we're going to see that for each of our different zones or a lot of our different systems, those same threats or those same causes are leading a lot of our high risk scenarios. And so if we identify that and we can address those areas first by implementing countermeasures that knock out a lot of our risk, that are easier to do. We should always start with that and take the simple steps that we can to reduce the risk now, and then look at having a continuous improvement approach for more invasive countermeasures that may have a potential impact on availability or may require system downtime to implement. So we can always think about what can we do now to reduce the risk, and then what's our plan for implementing additional controls that are required over time. And so the idea is, even if we picture industrial cybersecurity as this big boulder, we've got this big challenge or big gap that we're trying to address. It's not realistic to have one person pick up that entire load, or one person tackle that entire area. We should make sure that the right team is in place, that we've built that buy-in with the key stakeholders, and then it really is incremental steps. And as we start to get that ball rolling, and then we get pilot sites done, we see improvements, we see benefits, then it'll really help other sites gain momentum and be able to more effectively roll out and follow those requirements as well. So as we build that momentum, we can really see more changes and faster improvements.